I spent 3 years trying to escape my past, but when a manila envelope arrived on my doorstep, I realized someone had spent those same 3 years orchestrating a perfect frame-up to destroy me. They thought they could use a fake criminal accusation to break my life, but they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated exactly what a woman with nothing left to lose is capable of doing. The divorce papers had been signed 3 years ago, and I had spent every day since then painstakingly rebuilding the ruins of my life. My ex-husband, Mark, had left me for a woman 20 years his junior, leaving behind a mortgage I could barely afford and a mountain of joint debt that he simply decided no longer concerned him. I thought I had finally reached the point of indifference, that cool, detached state where his name no longer triggered a spike in my heart rate. I was wrong. It started with a delivery. A manila envelope, thick and heavy, appeared on my doorstep on a Tuesday morning. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in an aggressive, sharp-edged script. I didn't think much of it until I sat at my kitchen island and pulled out the contents. My blood went cold. Inside were photographs. Not just photos of me, but photos of me in places I hadn't been in months. Me grabbing coffee near my office, me walking into my yoga studio, me sitting on a park bench alone. And beneath the photos was a letter. It wasn't written on stationery. It was printed on cheap copy paper, the ink slightly smeared. It claimed that they had evidence of my involvement in a sophisticated financial scheme, a total fabrication, and that if I didn't transfer $50,000 to an offshore account within 48 hours, they would take these documents to the authorities. They hinted at a connection to a larger group, implying that my non-compliance would result in a massive investigation into my personal finances, a move that would surely lead to an enormous prison sentence for crimes I hadn't even committed. I sat there, frozen, the paper trembling in my hands. Then, the final page revealed the true hand behind the curtain. It was a picture of Mark's new wife, Clara, posing next to a man I'd never seen before, the same man I had spotted lingering near my car 3 days ago. They weren't just trying to extort me, they were trying to frame me. They had constructed a narrative, a complex, organized scheme that pinned their own financial instability on me. They were painting me as the mastermind, hoping that if they leaned on me hard enough, I would crack, pay up, and disappear. Or worse, if I didn't pay, they would forward this evidence to the Service of Internal Security, claiming I was handling prohibited substances or facilitating the movement of illegal weapons. It was a terrifying attempt to break my life with a formal criminal accusation. I didn't call Mark. I didn't call the police because I knew how easily a narrative could be twisted when you were the one being targeted by someone with resources. Instead, I called the only person I trusted, Elena, a shark of a divorce attorney who had navigated me through the darkest days of my separation. When Elena arrived at my apartment an hour later, she didn't look shocked. She didn't look panicked. She sat at my kitchen table, laid the photos out with clinical precision, and examined them with a magnifying glass she kept in her designer briefcase. Her silence was louder than any outburst. Finally, she looked up, her eyes hard, reflecting the dull gray of the morning sky. "They've spent a lot of money to make you look like a criminal," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "But they made a critical error in their staging. They think you're the same woman who cried in my office 3 years ago. They think you're scared." "I am scared, Elena," I whispered, my voice cracking. "They're threatening to ruin me. They're talking about these illegal accusations. How do I fight this without losing everything?" Elena smiled then, a tight, predatory expression that didn't reach her eyes. She stood up and walked over to my laptop, plugging in a small, encrypted drive she had brought with her. "They think they're running a game of chess, but they've left their king completely exposed. They've tried to weave a web of lies about packages with illegal substances and unauthorized activities. They even used a burner phone to send the metadata attached to these photos. They think they're invisible." She turned the laptop screen toward me. It displayed a map of the city with dozens of pulsing red dots. "I've been tracking Mark's financial movements for 6 months, ever since he tried to hide those offshore assets during the final settlement audit. I knew he was getting desperate. I didn't know he was this stupid." She scrolled through a series of bank statements and encrypted chat logs that had been intercepted. "Mark and Clara aren't just extorting you. They've been involved in a shadow operation to funnel cash through a shell company. It's a classic organized scheme. When the authorities look at the evidence they've fabricated against you, they're going to find a digital trail that leads right back to Mark's front door. But we need a countermove, one that shuts them down before they even have a chance to breathe. "What's the move?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Elena leaned in, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "We don't go to the police yet. We invite them here. We pretend we're going to meet their demands, and we draw them out into the open. We make them think they've won, so they'll walk right into a trap we've meticulously built." As I started to process the weight of her plan, my phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from an unknown number. My stomach dropped as I read the words, the screen glowing ominously in the dim light. It was a photo of me, taken from the inside of my own living room, looking through the gap in my curtains. "We know your lawyer is there," the message read, "but she won't be able to save you from what happens when the front door opens." The silence in the room was suffocating. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the glass, unable to comprehend that someone was watching us from the shadows of my own backyard. Elena didn't flinch. She snatched the phone from my hand, her eyes scanning the device with a cold, calculated efficiency. She typed a quick reply, something cryptic and short, before turning the phone face down on the granite countertop. "Don't look at the windows," she commanded, her voice low and steady. "If they know we're onto them, they're going to try to intimidate us into silence. They want us reactive, nervous, and making mistakes. That's how they win." I tried to breathe, but my chest felt like it was being compressed by a vice. "They're watching us right now, Elena. How can you be so calm? This is beyond a legal dispute. This is a direct threat to my safety." Elena stood up and walked over to the curtains, but she didn't pull them back. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, handheld device that hummed with a low-frequency vibration. She swept it slowly around the room. When she reached the smoke detector, the device emitted a sharp, high-pitched whine. She sighed, a sound of grim satisfaction. "Hardwired cameras. They've been in your house for at least 48 hours. My skin crawled. The thought of them watching me sleep, watching me get ready in the morning, watching me cry at my desk, made me want to burn the house to the ground. "What do we do? Do we leave?" "No," Elena said, her eyes locked on mine. "If we leave, they'll know we found the bugs. We play the part. We act like terrified, desperate victims who have no other choice but to pay. We have 48 hours to turn this entire situation into a self-destruct mechanism for Mark and Clara." She sat back down and opened her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys with rhythmic precision. She began pulling up digital blueprints of their lives, not just their bank accounts, but their burner phone logs, their encrypted social media messages, and the metadata from the photos they had sent. She explained that she had been building a case against Mark for months, waiting for him to make a slip-up, but she hadn't expected him to be this brazenly criminal. "He thinks he's a genius," Elena muttered. "He thinks by painting you as a participant in his group's illicit trade of prohibited substances, he can leverage a plea deal for himself if he ever gets caught. He's setting you up to be the sacrificial lamb for the service of internal security." I felt a surge of cold fury replace my fear. Mark had always been a coward, someone who lived off the labor of others and hid behind the strength of the women he manipulated. Seeing his plan laid out in cold, hard data transformed my helplessness into a weapon. "What's the countermove?" Elena leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a secret pact. "They've sent a digital invoice for the transfer. I'm going to create a mirrored account. We'll show them the transaction is pending, which buys us time. Meanwhile, I have a contact within the forensic cyber unit. Once they try to access the funds, the account will lock, and it will trigger an automatic ping to the Service of Internal Security, tracing their exact GPS coordinates." It was a brilliant, dangerous gamble. It turned the extortion attempt into an active investigation where they were the ones committing the crime in real time. But as we worked, the atmosphere in the apartment began to shift. The temperature seemed to drop, and the silence outside became heavy with intent. Around 2 a.m., the lights in my apartment flickered and died. A total blackout. I stood up, my heart racing, and moved toward the hallway. Elena gripped my arm, pulling me back into the shadows of the kitchen. Stay put, she hissed. The power didn't go out on the street, I whispered, pointing to the neighboring buildings, their windows glowing with warm yellow light. They're cutting the perimeter, Elena said, reaching into her bag for a heavy, tactical flashlight. She handed it to me. If they enter, you don't fight them. You go to the secondary safe room in the pantry and trigger the silent alarm. I have the digital trail secured. We waited in the absolute darkness. My senses were heightened to an agonizing degree. I could hear the wind brushing against the siding, the distant hum of a car engine idling down the street, and then the distinct sound of a key turning in the front lock. My breath hitched. They had copied my house key. Heavy, muffled footsteps echoed in the foyer. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. They were confident. Through the darkness, I could see two shadows creeping into the living room, illuminated faintly by the moonlight filtering through the blinds. One of them held something in his hand. Not a firearm, but something even more terrifying. A heavy metal object that caught the dim light. They stopped in the center of the room, looking toward the kitchen. "We know you're in there," a man's voice called out, cold and devoid of any human warmth. It wasn't Mark. It was the man from the photos. "Don't make this difficult. Just hand over the laptop and we won't have to report those illegal activities to the authorities. You know how quickly a simple accusation of dealing with prohibited substances can end a life." Elena squeezed my hand, her grip bruising. She looked at me, a silent command in her eyes. It was time for the trap to spring. She reached down to the floor, her hand finding a hidden switch she had installed under the island earlier that evening. "Now," she whispered. As she flipped the switch, the living room didn't just light up. Every single smart device in my home, the speakers, the television, the alarm system, erupted at once, blaring an ear-splitting, high-frequency sound meant to disorient and incapacitate. The men screamed, dropping their weapons and clutching their ears. Elena shoved me toward the back of the house, but as I turned to run, the front door swung open completely, and a third figure stepped into the light. It wasn't one of the men. It was Clara. She looked wild, her hair disheveled, a manic grin plastered across her face. "Did you really think you could play this game against us?" she shrieked over the siren. She raised a phone to her ear, her eyes fixated on me. "I'm calling it in. I'm reporting you for everything. Let's see who they believe, a respectable businesswoman or a criminal who just tried to poison her own ex-husband." She didn't wait for a response. She began speaking into the phone, her voice clear and practiced, reciting a detailed, fabricated story about me handling prohibited substances. She was selling the lie to the authorities in real time, and I realized with a jolt of horror that Elena's trap might have been too slow. As Clara finished her sentence, a loud, authoritative knock hammered against the front door, not from the intruders, but from the other side, the side of the police. They were already here, and they weren't looking for the men. They were looking for me. The pounding on the door was rhythmic, heavy, and undeniably official. The sirens from my smart system were still wailing, creating a chaotic wall of sound, but the authority behind those knocks cut through the noise like a blade. Clara stood in the entryway, her face twisted into a mask of triumph, her phone still pressed to her ear. She wasn't just reporting me. She was narrating a performance, painting me as a desperate, cornered criminal about to commit a final act of violence. "They're coming for you!" Clara shouted over the din, her voice laced with a terrifying, jagged delight. "I told them you were armed and that you were preparing to dispose of evidence. By the time they break this door down, your life as you know it is over." Elena didn't panic. She didn't even look at the door. While Clara was busy savoring her victory, Elena was moving with the fluid, calculated grace of a predator. She lunged forward, not toward the intruders, but toward the wall where the smart home hub was mounted. She ripped the back panel off, exposing the wires, and tapped a sequence into her own device. In an instant, the high-frequency siren died, replaced by a sudden, jarring silence. Then, the speakers, my living room speakers, began to play back a recording. It wasn't my voice. It was Mark's voice. "Just make sure the bags are in the trunk before the patrol passes by," the audio boomed, crystal clear, echoing off the high ceilings. "If we get stopped, remember, the client is the one with the target on her back. We're just the whistleblowers. Once the Service of Internal Security finds the substance on her property, we're clean, and the money is ours." Clara froze. Her phone slipped from her hand, hitting the hardwood with a dull thud. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking hollowed out. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mark was always arrogant," Elena said, her voice cutting through the room like ice. "He thought he could coordinate his organized scheme over a line I wasn't monitoring. He forgot that when you live in a house equipped with advanced security, you never really have a private conversation." The pounding on the door intensified. The hinges groaned under the pressure of a battering ram. "Service of Internal Security! Open the door immediately!" Elena turned to me, her eyes burning with a fierce intensity. "Listen to me. The next 30 seconds will determine the rest of your life. When they come through that door, you say nothing. You let me do the talking. You are the victim of an extortion attempt that has escalated into a home invasion. Do you understand?" I nodded, my breath coming in jagged gasps. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked at the 3 men, Clara's accomplices, who were now scrambling to retrieve their dropped weapons, their bravado shattered by the audio of their own boss betraying them. They were looking at the door with the same terror I was. "They won't take you," Elena promised. "They're here because of the false report Clara filed, but the moment they step inside, they're going to walk right into a digital evidence locker." The door exploded inward. Splinters of wood flew through the air as armored figures swarmed into the room. They moved with terrifying efficiency, their tactical gear making them look like ghosts of a war zone. I dropped to the floor, covering my head, just as Elena stepped forward, her hands held high, her phone held out like a shield. "My name is Elena Vance, counsel for the homeowner," she shouted, her voice calm and commanding. "We have been expecting you. We have evidence of a coordinated extortion attempt and an illegal home invasion in progress." The lead officer stopped, his weapon raised, his eyes scanning the room. He looked at the intruders, then at Clara, who was now trembling, her hands raised in surrender. "Secure the perimeter!" the officer barked. I looked up, squinting against the harsh tactical lights. My eyes locked onto the lead officer, a man with a grim, hard-set jaw. He stepped over the debris of my front door and looked directly at me. He didn't look like a savior. He looked at me with a suspicion that made my stomach turn. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cold, "we received a detailed report of a massive cache of forbidden substances and illegal weapons located on these premises. We have a warrant to search the entire property." My blood turned to ice. "What?" I whispered. "That's a lie. Clara fabricated that to—" "Save it for the interrogation," he interrupted, gesturing to his team. "Search the basement. Tear the walls down if you have to. We don't stop until we find what we were tipped off about." Elena stepped between us, her face pale for the first time since this nightmare began. "Officer, you are being manipulated by a coordinated scheme. If you search that basement, you are walking into a trap meant to frame my client. We have digital logs that prove—" "I don't care about your logs," the officer snapped, his gaze shifting to a spot just behind me. I turned, following his eyes. My heart stopped. One of the intruders, a man I hadn't paid much attention to, was pointing at a loose floorboard in the corner of the room, one that I hadn't touched in years. A small, dark-colored duffel bag had been kicked into view from underneath the sofa, its zipper slightly open. Even from where I sat, I could see what was inside. It wasn't just cash. It was rows of sealed packets filled with a crystalline substance. "Found it," the officer said, and his men began to swarm the area, their weapons drawn, not on the intruders, but on me. "That's not mine!" I screamed, but the officer had already grabbed my arm, his grip bruising. "You're under arrest," he growled. As he tightened the handcuffs, a shadow moved at the edge of the doorway. It was Mark. He stood there, watching the scene unfold with a look of mock concern. He held a phone, and he was recording me. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with fake sadness. "I tried to tell you to stay out of that business, but you just wouldn't listen." He turned to the lead officer, his expression changing to one of helpful cooperation. "I'm the one who called in the anonymous tip, officer. I couldn't let her go any further with this. She's deep in an organized network, and she's dangerous." The officer looked at Mark, then back at me, his eyes narrowing. Seems like we have our primary witness. As they began to drag me toward the door, my eyes met Elena's. She was staring at the bag, and for the first time, her face betrayed a hint of absolute, unbridled shock. She leaned toward me, whispering, That bag wasn't there when I swept the room. Someone planted it after they entered the house, and they knew exactly where the cameras would be blind." I realized then that the trap hadn't been laid for Mark and Clara at all. It had been laid for me, and we had walked into it with our eyes wide open. As I was pushed out into the cold night air, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. Out of it stepped a woman in a sharp gray suit, holding a folder with the seal of the Service of Internal Security. She looked at me, then at Mark, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Everything is according to plan," she said, her voice cold. "Take her in. We have a long night ahead." The interior of the transport vehicle was windowless, smelling of ozone and floor wax. I was shackled to the metal bench, my wrists raw from the tight grip of the cuffs. I had been processed into a facility that felt less like a police station and more like a high-security black site. Every step of the way, Mark's voice haunted me, ringing in my ears like a death knell, the sound of a man who had successfully rewritten reality. Elena had been forcibly separated from me the moment we reached the holding area. The woman in the gray suit, who I later learned was a senior operative named Director Holloway, had confiscated Elena's tablet before she could even reach the interrogation room. My lawyer was being held in a separate sector, and the last thing she had whispered to me before they dragged her away was, "They aren't following the law, they're following a script. Keep your mouth shut, no matter what they show you." The interrogation room was a concrete box with a single, buzzing fluorescent light. I sat there for hours, the silence broken only by the hum of the ventilation system. When the door finally opened, it wasn't the lead officer who entered, but Director Holloway. She tossed a thick file onto the metal table and sat opposite me, her expression unreadable. "You're in a very precarious position," Holloway said, her voice smooth and devoid of any human inflection. "The items found in your home, the packets with the controlled substance and the records of the organized scheme, are enough to lock you away for decades. A massive, unavoidable, enormous prison sentence is waiting for you, unless you're willing to play ball." "I was framed," I said, my voice hoarse. "Mark and Clara planted those items. I have evidence. My lawyer has logs." Holloway cut me off with a sharp laugh. "Your lawyer's logs are currently being scrubbed by our tech division. And as for your ex-husband? He's currently in a conference room with us, providing a full deposition. He's painting a very consistent picture of a woman who felt left behind by her marriage and decided to finance her lifestyle through the distribution of these substances. He has photos, dates, and even intercepted emails that corroborate every single one of his claims." My head spun. "Emails? I never sent those." "Digital footprints are so easy to manufacture, aren't they?" Holloway leaned in, her eyes cold. "But here's the interesting part. We know you aren't the mastermind. You're too messy. You're the front. We want the person above you. We want the head of the network." "I don't know any head of a network," I shouted, the chair screeching against the floor. "If you don't give us a name, we move forward with the prosecution," Holloway stated, standing up and sliding a single photograph across the table. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was a photo of me taken at a restaurant 3 weeks ago. I was alone, but in the background, sitting at the bar, was my father. He had been dead for 5 years. "Explain this," Holloway commanded. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. That wasn't my father. It was a man who looked exactly like him, a man I had seen once or twice in my childhood, a man my mother had warned me never to talk about. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My life wasn't being dismantled because of a bitter divorce. It was being dismantled because of a legacy I didn't even know I was a part of. "I don't know who that is," I whispered, though my voice betrayed my fear. Holloway leaned down, her face inches from mine. "That is the man who currently holds the keys to the organized scheme you've been funneling money through. He's been in the country for 3 months, and he's been using your accounts as his primary conduit. If you help us get to him, we make the charges go away. If you don't, you disappear into the system." "You're using me as bait," I realized. This isn't about an extortion attempt. This is about you catching him, and you don't care if I'm collateral damage." Holloway didn't answer. She simply turned and walked toward the door. "You have 1 hour to decide. Your ex-husband is waiting in the lobby to provide further testimony. He's very eager to see justice served." I was left alone again. The gravity of the situation was crushing. Mark wasn't just a bitter ex-husband. He was an informant, a pawn in a game I hadn't even realized was being played. If I refused, I was going to be the victim of a massive judicial setup. If I agreed, I was walking into the path of a man who was clearly powerful enough to warrant the attention of the highest levels of the Service of Internal Security. I looked at the light above me. There was a faint red glow, a camera. They were watching, waiting for me to break. I realized that if I was going to survive, I couldn't be the victim anymore. I had to be the player. I stood up and walked to the door, pounding on it until the guard finally peered through the small glass window. "I'm ready to talk," I said, my voice steady for the first time. "But I'm not talking to her. I want to see the person who really sent you to my house." The guard hesitated, then opened the door. He didn't take me to Holloway. He took me down a long, sterile corridor to a room at the very end of the hall. He pushed me inside and locked the door behind me. The room was dimly lit. A man sat in a leather chair, his back to me. He was reading a file, my file. "You've been a very difficult case to crack," he said, his voice deep and familiar. He spun the chair around, and I felt the air leave my lungs. It was the lead officer who had arrested me, the one who had seemed so suspicious. But he wasn't wearing his uniform anymore. He was wearing a bespoke suit, and he was holding a glass of scotch. "I'm not the police," he said, taking a sip. "And neither is Holloway. We're part of something much larger. And you, my dear, are the only one who can lead us to your father's vault." He gestured to a screen on the wall. It showed a live feed of the police station lobby. Mark and Clara were sitting there, laughing, drinking coffee, and waiting for me to be shipped to the prison transport. Then, the lobby doors opened, and a man walked in. I looked at the screen, and my vision blurred. It was the man from the photo, the man who looked like my father. He walked straight up to the front desk, bypassed the officers, and held up a badge that made every single person in the room stand up and salute. "He's here," the man in the chair said, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "And he's not here to save you. He's here to collect his investment." The man in the leather chair, who I now realized was orchestrating a power struggle far beyond my divorce, gestured toward the screen. The man who looked like my father, a man I now knew was named Silas, didn't even glance at Mark or Clara. He walked past them as if they were furniture, his presence radiating an authority that made the entire lobby of the police station vibrate with tension. "He's not here for the extortion scheme," the man in the chair said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "He's here to erase the trail, and that includes you, Mark, and even Director Holloway." My mind raced. The organized scheme wasn't just about money. It was about the control of a legacy I hadn't known I possessed. My father, whoever he really was, had left behind something, and everyone in this room was a scavenger fighting over the carcass of my life. "Why me?" I asked, my voice steady, my fear finally hardening into something colder, sharper. "I'm nothing to you." The man stood up, walking toward me. "You're the only one with the biometric key to the vault. Silas has been chasing it for years, but he needs you alive, or at least, he needs your cooperation, to access what's inside. If you go back to that lobby, he'll take you. He'll make it look like a tragic accident involving your criminal ex-husband. You'll be the collateral damage of a drug-related incident." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, metallic device. "I can get you out of here, but you have to give me the vault, and you have to do it right now." I looked at the screen. Silas was approaching the desk, speaking to the sergeant. I saw Mark stand up, his face breaking into a sycophantic grin, clearly expecting a reward from the man he thought was his new partner. Silas leaned in, whispered something to Mark, and then, with terrifying casualness, pulled a suppressed weapon from his coat and silenced Mark before he could even blink. Clara didn't even have time to scream before she was silenced too. The entire lobby descended into panic, but Silas stood amidst the chaos, calm as a statue, his eyes fixed on the security camera. He knew I was watching. I looked at the man in the chair. He wanted the vault too. They were all sharks, and I was the bait. I realized that the only way to win this was not to run, but to collapse the whole game on top of them. "I'll give you the location," I said, leaning in, "but I need you to do one thing. Put me on the line with the real authorities, the ones who don't work for Silas or Holloway." He hesitated, then pulled out an encrypted phone. "You're playing a dangerous game." "I'm done playing," I snapped. I took the phone and dialed a number I had memorized during the darkest days of my divorce. The number of the Internal Affairs Division Chief, who had once told me that if I ever felt I was in too deep, I should call him directly. He answered on the first ring. I didn't waste time. I described the room, the man in the chair, the feet of the lobby, and the exact coordinates of the facility I was being held in. I told him Silas was inside the building. The man in the chair smiled, thinking I was handing over the vault. He led me through a back exit, convinced he had won. But as we stepped out into the humid night air, the entire complex was swarmed. Black-clad tactical teams from the actual government authorities, not the puppets of Silas or Holloway, descended from the darkness. The man in the chair was tackled before he could react. Silas, emerging from the front of the station, stopped in his tracks, staring into the floodlights of the converging authorities. He didn't run. He looked at the chaos, his face blank, and simply dropped his weapon. He knew the game was over. 2 hours later, I sat in the back of an ambulance, a thermal blanket wrapped around my shoulders. Elena was there, looking as sharp and composed as ever, despite the madness. She handed me a document. "It's all gone," she said softly. "The organized scheme, the fabricated evidence, the extortion, it's all being tied to Silas. And because you acted as the primary informant for the takedown, the immunity agreement is absolute. You're free." "What about the vault?" I asked. Elena leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "The vault was a bluff. There was nothing there, just a legacy of debt and secrets that Silas wanted to control. By exposing him, you destroyed the only leverage he had. You didn't just survive this, you dismantled an entire network by forcing them to show their hands." I watched as they wheeled the bodies of Mark and Clara away in heavy black bags. I felt no grief, only a profound, hollow sense of peace. I had spent 3 years fearing the man who left me, only to realize he was just a small-time crook in a much larger, darker world. I stood up, leaving the blanket on the floor of the ambulance. My phone buzzed, a final notification. It was a message from an unknown number. "The account is empty. The game is over." I dropped the phone into a waste bin and walked toward the light of the police cruisers. I wasn't the victim, and I wasn't the bait. I was the person who had walked through the fire and burned the house down behind me. As the sun began to rise over the city, I realized that for the first time in 3 years, I didn't have to look over my shoulder. The nightmare was over, and for the first time, the future was entirely mine to define.